The snow fell in slow, silent waves, blanketing the world in white. The icy wind cut through the air like knives, and the bitter chill made every breath sting like fire in the lungs. In the middle of that frozen landscape, a little girl in a tattered red coat knelt in the snow, her small hands clasped tightly together, trembling not just from the cold, but from something deeper: desperation. Her lips quivered as she whispered a plea that seemed too fragile to pierce the howling wind. Yet in that moment, with tears freezing on her cheeks and her knees buried in the snow, that tiny voice was about to set into motion a chain of events that would change more lives than anyone could have ever imagined. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the incredible loyalty of animals, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Pawsitive Tales. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories to life. It had been 3 days since little Elsie had last felt the warmth of a home. Once not so long ago, she'd lived in a small but cozy wooden cabin at the edge of the forest with her parents. There had been laughter, the smell of cinnamon from her mother's kitchen, and the gentle hum of her father's guitar. But life, as it so often does, had turned cruelly in an instant. A fire had swallowed their home one bitter winter night, and though Elsie and her parents had escaped with their lives, they had lost everything else. The shelter they'd been promised in town was full, the charities were stretched thin, and so they were left wandering from place to place, seeking warmth where there was none. Elsie's parents did everything they could. Her father took odd jobs, chopping wood for neighbors, clearing snow from walkways. Her mother bartered what few belongings they had left for bread and soup. But the days were long and the nights longer still, and as the winter deepened, hope began to feel like a distant memory. One morning, as the frost clung thick to the windows of the makeshift shed they'd been sleeping in, Elsie overheard her parents whispering. They were talking about sending her to a children's home, a warm place with food where she might at least be safe. Just until we get back on our feet, her mother's voice cracked. But Elsie knew what that meant. She had heard stories of children sent away who never came back. She couldn't bear the thought of losing them too. That afternoon, when the sky was the color of pewter and the cold gnawed at her fingertips, Elsie wandered away from the shed and into the woods beyond. She didn't know where she was going, only that she wanted to do something, anything. Somewhere deep inside, she still believed in miracles. It was then, through the swirling snow, that she saw them. 2 tiny shapes huddled together on a frozen bench, their fur dusted white with frost. Puppies, no older than a few weeks, trembling violently against the biting wind. Their eyes were dull with exhaustion, and their little bodies shivered with the same helplessness she felt inside. Elsie's heart clenched. She knew what it was like to be cold and hungry. She knew what it was like to feel forgotten. Without thinking, she stumbled toward them, sinking to her knees in the snow before the bench. "Oh, you poor things," she whispered, though her voice was barely audible against the wind. She cupped her hands and breathed warm air into them, rubbing them together before gently reaching out. The puppies flinched at first, wary and frightened, but they didn't have the strength to run. Slowly they looked up at her, 2 pairs of pleading eyes meeting 1 pair of tear-filled ones. "I won't leave you," Elsie murmured. And though the puppies couldn't understand her words, they seemed to understand her heart. She took off her scarf and wrapped it around them as best she could, then pulled them into her lap, pressing them against her chest to share what little warmth she had left. It wasn't much. In truth, it was almost nothing. But it was everything she could give. Time passed. Minutes stretched into an hour. The cold bit deeper into her skin, turning her fingers numb and her lips blue. But Elsie didn't move. She held those puppies close, rocking them gently, whispering to them as though they were her only friends in the world. Maybe, in that moment, they were. It was a passing woodcutter who found them, a man named Henrik, known in town for his gruff exterior and solitary ways. He was trudging home with an axe slung over his shoulder when he saw the small shape in red crumpled in the snow. At first he thought it was a doll. Then he heard the faintest whimper. He rushed over and knelt beside her. Elsie was barely conscious, her breath shallow, her cheeks pale and lips trembling. The puppies were still clinging to her chest, their tiny hearts beating weakly but steadily. Henrik scooped them all into his arms without a second thought and carried them back to his cabin. He stoked the fire high, wrapped Elsie in blankets, and warmed milk for the pups. Hours passed before her eyes fluttered open. When they did, they met Henrik's weathered, tearful gaze. "Why?" he asked softly, though perhaps more to himself than to her. "Why would you risk your life for them?" Elsie swallowed, her throat dry and raw. "Because no one else would." Those 5 words pierced something deep inside Henrik, something he had buried long ago. Years before, he had lost his wife and daughter in a carriage accident. Since then, he had shut the world out, convinced that love only led to pain. But here before him was a little girl who had nothing, and yet still chose to give everything for 2 helpless creatures. Henrik made a decision that night. He found Elsie's parents the next morning and offered them shelter in his cabin until they could rebuild their lives. He helped Elsie nurse the puppies back to health, and in time, the little dogs became part of their new family. The once lonely woodcutter laughed again, his home filled with warmth and love. Elsie's parents found work and stability, and Elsie, the girl who had once knelt shivering and hopeless in the snow, became known in the village as the girl with the heart of fire. The puppies grew strong and loyal, never leaving Elsie's side. They would often follow her into the woods as she collected firewood or played in the snow, and the villagers would smile and shake their heads. She saved them, they'd say, but maybe they saved her too, and in a way they had. Those tiny lives she had refused to abandon had given her family a second chance, thawed a grieving man's heart, and reminded everyone who heard the story that even the smallest act of compassion can ripple outward and change the world. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Pawsitive Tales, and don't forget to leave a comment below. Special request: comment, kindness can change everything. If you believe that even the smallest act of love, like a shivering plea in the cold, can create miracles no one thought possible.